Everybody's saying,
তোমাদের তো
hey, good morning. I'm happy to see everybody here today. Begin by wishing everybody who's celebrating either Easter or Passover or Ramadan this month continued peace and joy. It's pretty interesting. It is only once every 33 years that all of these celebrations happen together. So just very interesting fact. And, you know, as we begin this morning, we know that most of the conflicts we talk about during our meetings are words and actions targeting somebody really because of who they are, either based on their race, their color, their religion, national origin, sexual identity. And we get involved with incidents on so many levels that are motivated by hate or bias. We review all of the incident reports that are coming in, whether they come from our police departments or they're coming from our website. And we really try to give wraparound services to the people who have been impacted, whether the behavior that's being alleged is something that rises to a level of a crime or not. We convene community conversations to address specific situations, host social justice roundtables in our schools, something that the kids find incredibly helpful. And we originally thought would be a program of one meeting with the kids and then we would move on. The kids have liked them so much that we've developed several layers of meetings for them. And we continue, despite that work, to have law enforcement reporting to us a steady increase. This week, we began the prosecution of the most serious hate crime that has happened here in Middlesex County. Some of you may remember that Henry Tapia was murdered in Belmont just over 2 years ago. There was a verbal altercation at 4 o'clock in the afternoon between Mr. Tapia, a Black man, and a white man who lived in the neighborhood. It was something that escalated from what should have been nothing. Literally crowded kind of residential street, sort of a back and forth about who was going too slowly and whether stopping to pull into the driveway was unsafe. Started out people yelling at each other. The two of them were out on the street. Neighbors heard yelling back and forth, and then it seemed to be over. Situation seemed to have died down. They were both headed back to their cars when the allegation is that the defendant in that case then turned around and used probably the most hateful racial slur directed at Mr. Tapia. There was an exchange back and forth, and then the allegation is that the defendant hopped into his truck and just aimed his truck right at Mr. Tapia, running him over and killing him. And, you know, that obviously can't be tolerated. I live in that town, so seeing what it has done to the town in both good and bad ways has been incredibly unsettling over the last 2 years. And that's an extreme case, but I would say that pretty much every day we get those kind of interactions, obviously not ending up in those kind of injuries, but people engaging with others and speaking and acting from a place of hate and bias and ignorance. And there's been a lot of attention as well about educating our children about history, diversity, health education, gender identity. Just this morning, I counted at least 4 articles in the Boston Globe, a sort of back and forth on those issues. In 2021, there was a conservative effort to stop teachers from talking about diversity and inequality in the schools. And this is particularly important to us because across the 54 cities and towns of Middlesex County, we have every morning just under 250,000 kids who head out to kindergarten through 12th grade, as well as the 21 colleges and universities where we're bringing kids from literally all over the world. Those efforts at trying to say that these education efforts were divisive or that schools were taking sides on, quote, controversial issues have only gotten worse. and now include restrictions on teaching, on the use of books. I read this morning that Florida has now banned over 800 books. Over 800 books that they have said can't be in the kids' schools. And that brings the total that they've done so far to about 1,600. If you read the front page of the Metro section today, it's about the same kind of controversy happening in Newton over days that the Newton public schools have about inclusiveness and the controversy that's erupted there. So that whole piece can really have a devastating impact on our kids. We live in an interconnected world that gets smaller all the time, is always changing, and kids really have to have the critical thinking skills necessary to digest both history and current events. I spent last evening at the Newton Public Library with the Newton Youth Commission, teaching them the program we've developed about digital citizenship, about how to be a good consumer of news, how to be a fact checker, how to really be looking at what's the motivation of somebody who posts something. And that goes to making sure they really learn an accurate account of United States and world history. Because as we all know, you have to understand the events that happened in the past to somehow see where we are today, in many cases to prevent them from happening again. And history really contextualizes why certain language, certain phrases, certain behaviors are unacceptable, harmful, derogatory. And, for the most part, everybody knows this, and we see this all the time when the police are investigating something. Most people, having used some pretty offensive language, claim that they didn't know they were offending. They didn't understand that. They didn't understand the consequences. And in most cases, we have a sense. We may not know the history of that phrase, but we know it is not something that people are going to take as anything other than some type of harmful remark. But we don't always understand the accurate history or the impact and the meaning that those words have in our community. That's a place where restorative justice, especially with young people, has been very helpful. Kids who go into a school or some community building and write terrible words, make terrible symbols, they know they're bad, but they don't exactly understand why. And today we're going to learn more about the interconnectedness of history and how global agreements and world treaties, we've been blanketed in the last few days with the history of the Good Friday Accord in Northern Ireland, and trying to learn why that was important. It's true for so many treaties. They can have a worldwide impact on the way we understand history and the way we relate going forward. And we know that the working definition of anti-Semitism is it's a non-legally binding definition. It's intended to be used as guidance for government, for campus administrators, community stakeholders, law enforcement, when they're educating on anti-Jewish bias. They're supposed to use it to help assess claims of anti-Semitism and when to make an assessment that a crime might be classified as a hate crime that has targeted people who are Jewish. The definition was adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016, and it's also been adopted by our State Department. And Rob Leakin's here with us today to share the historical context behind those changes and the significance. And really, by understanding what anti-Semitism is, how it shows up, how it impacts individuals and communities, we're more likely to recognize it and more likely to be willing to speak out about it when we see it. And that's really what we need to be doing and need to be educating our young people about. And I'm really happy to have Rob back here with us again. The AJC has really been an incredible partner with us in this work, and always so generous. And Rob has been the director of AJC New England since 2008. He is himself the child of parents who survived Europe during the time of Hitler. He grew up with a deeply regarded sense of what opportunity the American democracy afforded to Jewish people and other vulnerable minorities. And he's been a passionate defender for years of civil rights and advocate in the fight against anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry, and a vocal proponent of a just and secure future for Israel and its neighbors. He began his career working with Holocaust survivors in Brooklyn, New York, became a lawyer, and served as an assistant district attorney before going on to be the director of the ADL's Connecticut and Boston offices and the senior vice president of Hebrew College. He's been a contributor to various media on topics ranging from Israel and anti-Semitism to intergroup relations and civil rights. He received his bachelor's degree from Vassar, a master's degree from Columbia, and his law degree from BC Law. So, Rob, I'm really grateful to have you here with us this morning. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. And thank you for that very thorough and really wonderfully enlightening opening presentation. You set the stage perfectly. I also want to just thank Antonia Thompson, who has just been wonderful to talk with and talk through how we should present today's program, and just a wonderful partner. And finally, just a quick thank you to all of you. As District Attorney Ryan said, I a few years ago served as an ADA. I had the opportunity to work on bias issues in that context. And I have a special appreciation for work of a task force like yours. So I'm grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you. I was asked to talk today about anti-Semitism and why it is important that it's defined, especially for those people who want to deal with such an issue, that it's defined, but even perhaps more importantly, that people have the tools to recognize it. Before I start, though, I just want to take a moment very quickly. Some of you I know are familiar with the American Jewish Committee. Some of you may be less so. So I want to just take a very quick moment to just say a little bit about who we are. We were founded at the turn of the last century, the beginning of the 20th century. We were an organization that was created that essentially to leverage the tools that democracy gives us to normalize the status of our community in an environment where there was tremendous anti-Semitism. That got us quickly involved in the civil rights movement. Here, we created some of the first public accommodation statutes and regulations. We became involved in Dr. King's movement. We became involved in a lot of research. Our work was cited in Brown versus Board of Education. And we've continued in that line with the difference that over the last 50 years, we've gradually also developed an international portfolio because they're vulnerable Jewish communities active around the world. And so today we have offices everywhere from Tokyo and Abu Dhabi to offices across the United States. With that quick preamble, let me just say I want to offer 3 points today. The first is that today there is a consensus within the American Jewish community that anti-Semitism has become a significant, even a serious issue. When I say consensus in Jewish community, you have to understand, those people who are familiar with the Jewish community will know, it's not that often that you hear those words in the same sentence. The Jewish community were accustomed to debating issues vigorously, but let me start by sharing the numbers. Each year, AJC does a survey of American Jewish opinion. The 2022 survey of 2022 opinion came out about 6 or 7 weeks ago, and it reported that 89% of American Jews today think that anti-Semitism has become a very or somewhat serious problem. 82% think it's increased over the past 5 years, and 41% reported that they believe that their status as Jews in the United States is less secure than it was a year ago. This impacts people in the Jewish community in the way they think and behave. 40% say they've changed behavior to avoid an anti-Semitic encounter. And by that, it means that they avoid going to certain places or to certain events. They avoid wearing certain kinds of clothing or ornaments that might suggest they're Jewish, and they hide who they are, their identity, when on social media. 36% reported that they had witnessed an anti-Semitic incident in the past year. 26% said they were targeted by an anti-Semitic act in the last year. 23% reported that a Jewish institution in which they are affiliated was targeted by an anti-Semitic act in the last 5 years. And that number becomes even steeper when you realize that more than 30% of the people who responded to the survey said that they weren't affiliated with a Jewish institution, people who identified as Jewishly. And 60% say they viewed anti-Semitic content online in the past year. That number rises to 84% when you're surveying people who are under 30. The Jewish concerns about anti-Semitic events have been validated in various ways. That number, 57%, that finds is a typo. The FBI report on 2021 incidents showed that just over 50% of religiously based hate crimes in 2021 were directed at Jews. Now, to put that into some context, Jews constitute 2 to 2.5% of the American population, but more than 50% of all religiously based hate crimes are directed against Jews. Overall hate crimes nationally, Jews were the 4th largest targeted community. The ADL does its own survey of anti-Semitic incidents, not hate crimes, and found that the incidents from 2021 to 2022 increased 36%. And when you look at New England, those numbers increased 41 cents. Beyond that data, there are attacks on members of the Jewish community that are increasing in ferocity and frequency. These are occurring most frequently to people who are readily identifiable as Jews, people who are wearing kippot, head coverings, or people who tend to be more Orthodox and dress in a particular way that identifies them as Jewish. We're also finding a spread, and I want to talk a little bit about this with you, with the spread of conspiracy theories that are directed against Jews. So you hear people with large social media followings, such as Kanye West, who start spreading regularly anti-Semitic content that circulates to many, many millions of people. Kanye West has more followers than there are Jews in the world. And so what you begin to have over time is a growing sense within the Jewish community that our community is becoming increasingly vulnerable as these kinds of things intensify. The Jewish community has been reacting in several ways, most importantly, closing their doors. I'm a regular synagogue goer. One of the things, much like it's true with churches and mosques, you could go in at 6 in the morning and the doors are opening, and you could leave at 9:30 at night and the doors would be open. That's no longer true. When I go in the morning, I need a fob to get in to the doors. That's not just where I go to synagogue. That's what most synagogues. At prayer times now, it's becoming increasingly customary to have some armed security present around the community because the threats against the community are increasing and becoming more vociferous. New organizations are popping up to deal with all facets of anti-Semitism. We're finding that in synagogues, there is doing training for an armed attacks is becoming normative. There's a changing climate for the Jewish community. Increasingly, we're arriving at a point where people in the Jewish community are asking a question. And that question, and I want to take a moment to just share this with you and talk it through. The question is, has the Jewish vacation from history come to an end? And when people say that, what they're saying is that before World War II, anti-Semitism was normative in this country. Prominent people voiced anti-Semitic views, prominent people in the government, industrialists like Henry Ford, political leaders like Lindbergh were out in the open about it. There was nothing you had to hide. about your anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was so acute that President Roosevelt, who was a friend of the Jewish community, went out of his way to make sure that there wasn't a perception that American soldiers were going over to Europe to protect or save the Jews. It was very important to him, specifically because he thought it would weaken the war effort. I say that not to criticize President Roosevelt, but to underscore how normal and normative anti-Jewish sentiment was in the United States. After World War II and the murder of 6 million Jews, the civil rights movement, the changing norms in the United States, there was really a sense that the Jewish community had entered a golden age. Jews were entering into places where they knew they couldn't get. When I was a kid growing up, I knew there were places I shouldn't try to work. I shouldn't try to get a job in a bank. I shouldn't try to get work in a company or corporation. Those were places that were out of bounds to Jews. All of that has changed and changed dramatically. So that today, increasingly, Jews have felt integrated and normalized within the larger American scheme. Increasingly, people are beginning to doubt whether that's true anymore and whether or not there's a changing temperature in this country. And this brings me to my second point. Anti-Semitism is not some kind of random form of hate. It's the product of conspiracy theories that have roots that go back 2,000 years. Let me give you two examples about what I mean by that. In about the year 1600, Shakespeare wrote a play called The Merchant of Venice. The Merchant of Venice, for those of you who are not familiar with the play, is built around a Jewish moneylender who is a hateful character, spiteful, mean, nasty, greedy, everything you could imagine. When Shakespeare wrote that play, he was writing it for an audience where in a country and for an audience that didn't know Jews. There hadn't been a Jewish community in the British Isles for 300 years. They'd all been expelled. And yet he wrote for an audience that recognized the character of the Jew in that picture. I want to pause on that and hold that for a minute. Let me give you another example. When several years ago, there was a large movement of people from Central America towards the Texas border, the idea started to circulate that it was Jews who were driving all these people to the Texas border. Why? Because there was a Jewish plan to turn the white race into mud people. That they would bring all these people into the country and they would destroy the white race so that Jews could become more powerful. That belief inspired someone to one day walk into a synagogue where Jews were praying and murder 11 people at prayer in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He went in there, he said it online before he went in, because he feared what the Jews were going to do to the white race. Now, I say that, to all of our ears, we hear that kind of talk and it sounds crazy. But the two stories that I just told you have something in common. They're conspiracy theories that place Jews at their center. And that's increasingly what Jews are recognizing today. Those conspiracy theories have roots and beliefs that came through the initial separation of Judaism and Christianity, when Judaism was cast as the moral opposite of Christianity. Jews were profane, Jews were carnal, Jews were unholy, Jews were unsacred, and over time, Jews became so associated with evil and Satan. As a result, conspiracy theories, when there was something that would go wrong, conspiracy theories would evolve that would identify Jews with bad things that happened. So when the plague hit Europe in the Middle Ages, it was identified as Jewish. But there's also modern analogs to that. When capitalists, the communists wanted to identify what was wrong with capitalism, they identified it as Jewish. And conversely, capitalists who looked at Bolshevism and wanted to criticize it, they also called it Jewish. And that has been a feature of anti-Semitism. It's the steady flow of conspiracy theories, non-fact-based ideas, where Jews are placed at the center of it, and the manipulator, the evildoer, that's at the heart of it. Part of what we see today is a proliferation of some of those kinds of conspiracy theories. So beyond the facts and the numbers and the surveys, the data you share, part of what people in the Jewish community are responding to is recognizing that these conspiracy theories are beginning to fly around and they're gaining audience. And that's setting everybody on, making everybody uneasy. What kind of conspiracy theories? Israel is responsible for 9/11. Jews are conspiring to control the world economy. By the way, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is about such a conspiracy, is one of the best-selling books in the world. Jews are responsible for economic oppression. Jews control the media. Israelis are training police in tactics used to oppress people of color. George Soros' secret hand behind all kinds of evil doing in the world. Jewish bankers caused forest fires by shooting lasers from space, forest fires in California. I mean, this is crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. But some of it's finding an audience, and increasingly it's a part of our lives. And this brings me to what is really my third point. We know that good people don't share these ideas. Good people don't have evil intentions toward the Jewish community, that in many respects, the Jewish community remains a welcome part of our society. At the same time, we know that if people don't understand and can't recognize what anti-Semitism is and how it manifests itself in the world, it's very hard to fight it. According to the AJC survey that I alluded to before, 1/3 of Americans have never heard of the word anti-Semitism or don't know what it means. But even those who are familiar with the word and understand that there's something wrong with it are likely not to always recognize, and this is something that District Attorney Ryan said before, are not likely to recognize when things may be anti-Semitic. And I would add that, by the way, that's true for a lot of Jews as well. Being able to effectively describe and explain what makes something anti-Semitic is a difficult thing. And part of the problem is we often rely on what I sometimes call the Potter-Stewart rule. Potter-Stewart was a Supreme Court justice, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, who was once asked to adjudicate a case dealing with pornography. And when asked to define what pornography was, he wisely didn't want to go there. And he said, well, you know it when you see it. That's often how people approach anti-Semitism. You say, you know it when you see it. And it's an entirely insufficient form of description for it. Ways that it's insufficient became evident in Europe about 15, 20 years ago, after 9/11, and before American Jews recognized the problem here. There was a mounting attacks against Jews in several countries in Europe, in France, in Belgium, in Germany, and several other countries. And the problem was that law enforcement and the courts didn't know what to do. And they didn't know what to do. And what was happening is the courts were adjudicating cases where they clearly didn't recognize when something may have been anti-Semitic. And that led to a discussion about the need for a definition, a need for a way to define what may be anti-Semitism, what could be anti-Semitic. And NGOs, including the American Jewish Committee and several countries, began to work on this problem to provide constructs that could be used to not only help courts and police and educators understand and identify when things may be anti-Semitic, but also to help policymakers think about and how to approach a problem in their country. And this led to the discussion about the creation of the definition. And as District Attorney Ryan pointed out, this definition, which went through about 10 years of discussion in various NGOs, was ultimately adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. A quick word about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which I will call IHRA from here on in. IHRA was created around the year 2000. It was led by the the Prime Minister of Sweden, who had gone on a trip to Germany and had gone to concentration camps there. And he was so moved by it, he thought it was important that Europe remember and preserve the memory of what happened to the 6 million people who were killed, but also learn from those lessons. And ultimately, the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, is an international organization. It has 33 member states. And those 33 member states took it upon themselves to adopt this definition in a formal way. Today, this definition, which I'll say more about, let me just share the screen again. Today, it's been endorsed by 40 countries, the Secretaries Generals of the United Nations and the Organization of American States, the European Parliament, the Obama-Trump administrations through the Department of State, scores of municipalities, universities, and NGOs, prominent Massachusetts and New England leaders, including 4 former governors, have all endorsed this definition. It is, what I want to understand is that this definition, how it works. This definition doesn't tell you what is anti-Semitic. What it does is provide symptoms for what could be anti-Semitic. It operates a little like WebMD. If you think about it, if you had a pain in your big toe, you might go to WebMD and you go there and it say, well, maybe you broke your toe, or maybe you sprained your toe, or maybe you have gout. It wouldn't say that you have gout. It would say you may have gout, go see your doctor, study it, look at all the circumstances. That's exactly what this definition does. It provides symptoms of what could be anti-Semitic in the lived experience of the Jewish community and others who have been involved in the fight against anti-Semitism. So here are some examples of what could be anti-Semitic. The demonizing Jews, or the power of Jews in the collective, i.e. that Jews control the media, the economy, the government, any of the scores and scores of conspiracy theories that somehow allege Jewish manipulative power, that Jews gather together to do things to harm the collective. Holding Jews responsible for acts real or imagined by a single Jew. Someone does something, it gets generalized to, this is what Jews do. Accusing Jews or Israel of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, something that happens too often, where the Holocaust is treated as if it's some kind of Jewish conspiracy to distract from the evil doings of Jewish people. Other symptoms are justifying or killing the harming of Jews in the name of an ideology or religious belief, denying the genocide of the Jewish people in World War II, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, applying double standards so that Jews or a Jewish state are held to standards that are not applied to any other people or nation. All of these are, none of these things are viewed as proof of anti-Semitism symptoms. They're simply suggestions that if you want to recognize what may be perceived as hostile to the Jewish community, these are things that could fulfill that. Let me say a comment about this, because I know it comes up frequently. Many people express concern that if they criticize Israel, that's somehow anti-Semitic. That should never be the case. In fact, if it were the case, most Israelis would be anti-Semitic. They're very active. As people follow the news, you can see discourse in that country, lots of criticism of the government all the time. And that should apply to people, anybody else. Criticizing Israel should never be considered by itself anti-Semitic. Where things start to cross into anti-Semitism is when people treat Israel in a way they treat no other country. So if Israel is held to a standard, it doesn't prove that someone's anti-Semitic. There may be reasons for doing that. But in many instances, Israel is being used as a shill for anti-Semitism because it's not cool to talk about anti-Semitism, it being overtly anti-Semitic in some circles. So it's a difficult space to negotiate someplace. But I think it's important to point out that everybody has a right to criticize any government. And that certainly is true of Israel. If people have opinions, they should be talked about, they should be debated, they should be discussed. When you embrace narratives that include statements of fact that may well be fiction, when it includes conclusions that are not tested or up for debate, it raises a question. It raises a question of whether or not there are other motives that a person may have. So I'm happy to talk about more of their questions about that. But the bottom line in all this, and I want to wrap up so we can get into a discussion here, is that the fight of anti-Semitism, no different than many other kinds of fights, the fight against racism, homophobia, other kinds of discrimination, requires a level of clarity so that people can begin to have coherent conversations that are about more than I think it's that way. Conversations that allow people benchmarks for beginning to think about what could be anti-Semitic, not only so that you can recognize what's outside, but so that we can also check our own beliefs and assumptions along the way. There are many things being done today in the area of fighting anti-Semitism. The Jewish community is mobilizing to do training so that people better understand what anti-Semitism is. AJC is involved now in organizing a organized a White House conference on anti-Semitism and brought in people from around the world who have much more experience than we do in the United States on this. There are a range of initiatives. All of them, though, are predicated on creating a language and a set of assumptions that help us have coherent conversations so we can negotiate these different things. So we are encouraging offices like this one, Middlesex DA's office, others around the state, around the country, to increasingly make use of this tool so that we can become fully cognizant of the ways we can participate in this fight. I thank you for your partnership. I thank you for the opportunity to share these views. Love to hear your thoughts and questions.
Thank you, Rob, as always. Questions, comments?
I'd like to add a comment if I may. I just want to thank DA Ryan and of course Rob for bringing us together. I think if you just change the word Jews to Asian American or to Muslim, to Blacks, to Hispanic, I mean, your story totally resonates with us. And I think it really is the same across the spectrum. You know, like you said, the Jewish community is not always seen eye to eye on certain things, and the same applies to the Chinese American community. But I think one thing that really brings us together is the fact that we're in this epidemic of hate, this era of Asian hate, and we cannot agree on anything else. We can at least agree on that we all need to work together to stem this tide and to bring back normalcy to our country. So thank you, Rob. Incredible presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Wilson.
Wilson. Yeah, it's the same thing. You place Jews with the word Chinese, it's the same thing.
Rob,
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask you if you could talk a little bit more when you talked about the acceptance of this definition within the Jewish community, and there are different groups within the Jewish community, whether it's Hasidic and so forth, and in different parts of the country, you're going to see that show up different, like if you're in Brooklyn as opposed to here in Massachusetts. Can you talk a little bit more of how those communities are using this definition? Because you're saying it doesn't specifically point out what the anti-Semitism would look like, but it seems to me that it would show up differently in different spaces that you're talking about, like that to recognize it. Some places more so than others. So within either the Jewish community or where you're having these conversations, are people struggling with what anti-Semitism means? Do they need to have like a roadmap of what it actually looks like? Or are you finding that people are more willing, if they've never heard the word, which that shocked me, that there are those that have never heard the word, are finding it helpful?
So it's a great question. And I think, as is always the case, things are variable. And so I think it's an important question. Let me just start at the top. You know, there are Jewish organizations, all kinds of Jewish organizations. There's a conference of major organizations. Once a year they meet, they talk, they have lunch together. This group, 51 of 53 of these organizations have endorsed the definition. And that includes diverse religious communities. It includes organizations from the political left and the political right that have endorsed it. We're really at the front end of beginning to educate people about this and its utility. So that's it. Not everybody in the Jewish community agrees with it, and the criticism comes from one space. The fear that if you adopt this definition, which in a number of places will allude to Israel, for example, it'll say if you hold Israel to a standard that no other country is held to, it may be suggestive of an anti-Semitic motive. Go and look at all the circumstances before you make a judgment. It actually puts the presumption on the person who's suspecting anti-Semitism as opposed to the opposite. But some people have responded to that and saying, well, if you do this and we adopt it, then will it mean that people will nevertheless assume that if you're critical of Israel, it's anti-Semitic? The definition is explicit no, but there have been two definitions, alternate definitions, that were created with the idea of carving out a space that makes it very clear that there's nothing wrong with criticizing Israel. My feeling about it is, there may be some words that I dicker about in each one of those definitions, but I think it's fine. They should coexist. The reason why we put such a priority on this definition is because for really two reasons. One is it's accessible. It is not academic. It's in simple language that can be used by a judge and by a person on the street. Secondly, it doesn't tell you what is anti-Semitic. It tells you symptoms. It leaves judgment to people who are there in a place. But most importantly, this definition has an international consensus building behind it. What that means is that for the first time in 2,000 years, where Jewish community and country after country and nation after nation and city after city have faced often brutal anti-Semitic attacks, expulsions, murder. For the first time in maybe 2,000 years, we actually have the opportunity to create a common language. I don't think this definition, it's a working definition, is perfect, but we have the opportunity to create a common language that people can work off of and build on, which is very modest. And so many of us are arguing and saying, this is a unique opportunity that should not be missed. So I hope I answered your question, Antonia, but I appreciate it.
We have two questions in the chat. The first is, in conversations with other residents of my community, I find that many don't believe that anti-Semitism exists around here. I take here in New England. What do you do about that? How do you address that?
I think it's true for all our communities. Sometimes it's hard for other people to live in your shoes. And And I don't think that's a particularly problem that's unique to anti-Semitism. I think, as Wilson said, and you said, this is a kind of issue that lots of communities struggle with, getting their narrative played. Look, I think the context in which that kind of question comes up is very often in the context of discussions about DEI programs. As I understood, DEI programs are performing a vital need at this moment, bringing together people, giving them a greater chance to participate in our government, in our corporations, in businesses, all kinds of venues. It's vital. I think that when you think about Jews in that convent, 40, 50 years ago, that might have been more of an issue. That's not the issue of the Jewish community. But when DEI programs go into talking about identity and discrimination and persecution and the experiences of different communities, there has been a conversation about, well, do Jews belong in that discussion? And I think from the vantage point of the Jewish community, the answer is absolutely. It's very important. What we have found in getting in these discussions is very often people simply don't know what the Jewish experience is. And when you sit down and have conversations with people, I find that over time, there's more flexibility, there's more interest, there's more engagement in ways that are very healthy. So we're trying to do that. We're, as an organization, we're ramping up educational programs for corporations, for government, that try to inform that space and bring the kind of engagement that we hope will over time be productive. But Leslie, I appreciate the question.
And to go back to the question, Nazar, of course, makes the same point that we've been talking about, that many of these same issues affect the Muslim community. A question that comes up all the time, as a municipal leader, what is the best way to, and should you, respond to anti-Semitic incidents that happen in towns or neighborhoods? I think this question comes up for us all the time. Something happens and the question is, do we do anything about it? Do we sort of pretend it didn't happen? If we're going to do something, what is the most effective thing to do?
You may be too polite to say that sometimes you hear different Jewish people saying the opposite things.
Right.
Yeah. As is true in just about any situation, those are fact-based questions. What are the circumstances? I think it is very, very important for people in leadership positions to demonstrate, whether it's anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, anti-Islamism, any of those kinds of realities, there needs to be a sense that the people in leadership are taking a strong stand. I think there's also a function of interpreting. And sometimes I recognize this can be politically difficult. Not all incidents are the same, right? And sometimes people react before they have all the information. I know that happens in the Jewish community sometimes. And look, defacing a school or a public building or somebody's home with a swastika is something. It's one of the kinds of things that happens to Jewish people, and it scares people because we don't know if there's violence behind that, right? If you know that this was a group of 7-year-olds who didn't know what a swastika is and what it signifies and what it means, it's a different thing than people who go to a synagogue and deface it in that way, and requires, I think, a different kind of response. One is educational, another may also be educational, but it raises a whole different level of concern. And I think that there is a need for judiciousness, and I think it often is difficult. Part of what we think is that the opportunity is to educate and to emphasize using incidents like these whoever it is against, whether it's against a Muslim or a Christian community or Jew, the opportunity to educate people about what's going on. We can't do enough of it in this environment. And I also would want to acknowledge some of the comments that were made that these are similar concerns that happen in the Chinese community, in the Muslim community. I think they are. The motivations may be different sometimes, but I think the fundamental concerns is the same. And it requires that we find ways to come together as communities to speak out, perhaps better than we do.
Thank you. Other comments, thoughts? All right, Rob, thank you as always. I think not only is it what your words educational, I think it also just illustrates what people are recognizing is the universality of this issue and the need for responses, the need for education. I think one of the values of the task force is to really bring people together to have those conversations and to think about, maybe in a quieter moment, what kind of response are you going to have when something happens? Because it is when, it's not if. And we always do better when we are prepared and have thought about how would we want to respond. And I think just as importantly, how would we want to be transparent to the community in letting them know, A, what happened, and then B, what the response is going to be. So this is incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you all for your good work.
Thank you all. We will meet again on May 11th. And David, I know I made a mistake yesterday. Opioids is on the 18th. This task force is on the 11th. Enjoy this gorgeous weather. Enjoy the holiday weekend. Take care. Thank you all. Thanks, Antonia.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marion.